Hello, everybody. My name is John McAuliffe, and I'm Associate Publisher here at Carcanet Press. And I'm really delighted to be hosting tonight's launch of Colm Tóibín's first collection, Vinegar Hill. Before we start, I have a few technical bits and pieces to tell you. The first one is to encourage you to use the chat box, which is there on the bottom of your screen. And when you use the chat box, if you can make sure that you turn the address to everyone, because I think it's automatically set to just go to the panelists. So make sure that you're, and tell us where you're from as well, as people have already started doing, and where you're joining us from, and what you're even doing tonight as you're listening into this launch. There's also a little box at the bottom here, the Q&A box. And if you have questions for Colm, there's going to be a chance at the end of the reading and after our conversation for me to put some of your questions to Colm as well. So do pop your questions in the Q&A box, which is right next to the little chat box at the bottom of it, so that we can draw you into the conversation at the end. So tonight's event is probably going to last around an hour. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Colm and about this book. And then Colm's going to read for about 25 minutes before we move to questions. And then we'll come back to what you have to say. So I saw Colm's poem High Up, which he's going to read tonight in Poetry Ireland Review 131, an issue edited by our friend Colette Bryce. It's a beautiful elegy, and it has the kind of perfect balance and reticence that I've always associated with Colm's prose. I wrote to Colm after I saw the poem, and I asked him if he had more where that came from. He did, and then across the pandemic, more poems came. First, a set of poems which appeared in New Poetry's 8, and then this powerful, measured, various book began to fall into place. And that really is what it felt like as Colm's reader, watching poems arrive and then almost create gaps around them where somehow or other different poems would emerge. Poems which felt inevitable, called onto the page by the other poem's initial marks. I'm going to come back to the poems in a minute, but I also wanted to say something about Colm's larger writing life and its relation to what this book does. As all of you will know, Colm's very distinguished career has moved from its outset easily between non-fiction and fiction. And I would say this has something to do with the fact that I've always thought that as somebody who also comes from a market town near the Irish coast, an unmistakable tang of the real. And I always thought it was to do with having something in common in terms of our backgrounds. But Colm's worldwide audience tells me that this is something which his readers everywhere recognize. That registering of what is something which is always fascinating me about his work. The way that public life responds to his fictional techniques, how known events are lifted and made malleable or somehow become part of other stories as he writes about them. And of course, alongside this, there's also his attention to what is private and unspoken and not to be spoken about, which is just as clearly registered. In his study of the poet Elizabeth Bishop, Colm declares his interest in the ways in which style and subject, art and life meet and shape one another. We know he does this in fiction and in essays. And the poems? Colm's poems establish their line and rhythm early. Casual phrases are set in motion, stories are conjured, and then another perspective opens us. A sudden turn pivots the poem, even as its rhythms persist. I think we can call this style. And I think he has found with this style a new way into his subjects, and it's a new ground for poetry too. Poets have emailed me grumbling a bit about how good this book is. Martina Evans in the Irish Times noticed both its light touch and, as in her own work, its maps where imaginary and real places converge, and the underworld undertow which draws us along. What she also observes is that here are themes and subjects that Colm has regarded for decades: family, nation, sex and desire, art, Europe and America, mortality and death. Colm is also, without wanting to apply too much pressure to him, a wonderful speaker and a teacher who has held research and teaching posts in a number of universities, including in Carcanet's hometown, Manchester. Tonight, he's going to read for the poems, as I said, for about 25 minutes, and then we'll go into the conversation. I can't wait to hear them. Colm.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. I do feel a bit of an imposter, so I understand why these poets might be grumbling. They're quite right. Anyway, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for publishing this book. And I'm going to read these poems. This first one is called September. It's a sonnet. The first September of the pandemic, the skies are watercolor, white and gray. Pembroke Street is empty, and so is Leeson Street. This is the time after time, what the world would look like when the world is over, when people have been ushered into seats reserved for them in the luminous heavens. Moving towards the corner of Upper Pembroke Street and Leeson Street, an elderly man wears a mask. His walk is sprightly, his movements brisk. I catch his watery eye for a watery moment. Without stopping, all matter of fact, he says, "Someone told me you were dead." This poem is called The Long Trick, and which is a nautical term, but it's anyway, I think it speaks for itself, this poem. Sometimes in these poems, instead, maybe I should put in much more implication, that not explain everything so clearly at the beginning, but I always feel if you don't do that, the reader really has no idea what you're writing about at all, and you have to put notes at the back or something. So I thought it was better just to explain clearly at the beginning of the poem what the poem was about. The Long Trick. Ingmar Bergman was still alive at the time I sailed on the Estonia past the inhabited islands beyond Stockholm on a winter Sunday, just as the dark was descending. I dreamed that he might come and mournfully wave at us, or that I might be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of him brooding at twilight, knowing how doomed we are, all of us. This was the same Estonia that sank between Stockholm and Tallinn the following year. 852 people drowned. But tonight feels long rather than dangerous. The man sharing my cabin goes to bed early. There is a restaurant for Swedes, as there always will be, and another lesser one for Estonians, with grim frankfurters and runny coleslaw. I wish I could recount some premonition that I foresaw, the water rushing up through the narrow corridors, waking us up from our sleep, and then everything dark and people calling out in Baltic languages, and then water covering everything, eventually even the ship. But it was ordinary on my night, and we arrived in Tallinn just as morning did. It was like that too when I went out on a boat to the Great Barrier Reef a month or two after. 2 divers had been left behind by mistake. It was simple. With everyone on deck, the man in charge had shouted, "Is everyone here?" What could the passengers do? They shouted yes. The 2 who were missing were skilled at using oxygen sparingly. So they were still down there, investigating the deep, as the boat started its engine and chugged back to Port Douglas. How clear it must have been once they surfaced that they would be unlikely to make it back to shore. I suppose they must have shouted. Maybe they swam for a while and hoped the boat would return for them when their absence was discovered. They must really have struggled before they died. On my trip, I was too scared to dive, not because of them, the 2 who disappeared, whose remains must be somewhere under us, but because I worried that I would come up too fast, which can be fatal. Your lungs can just explode. Instead, I snorkeled or swam with my face down in the welcoming water, looking at the different blues made all the more vivid by the light that seeped through the surface. And then I turned to float and look at the sky that was pale and washed, as though it had been too long underwater. The boat was in easy reach, so there was really nothing to worry about, nothing to suggest disaster. except the waves themselves, the swell that is unnatural, even at the best of times, all highs and lows, untrustworthy, even when calm, just undulating willfulness, no conscience, no regrets. And this is the poem that John was talking about, the poem High Up. It's from my friend Bernard Loughlin. And I mean, the first line was really to give Bernard a laugh, because he was always insulting me about how little I knew about birds, and how I didn't know the difference between a hawk and a handsaw. And he did. He was a tremendously skilled bird watcher. And and he died in the Pyrenees, high up into the village that he had gone back to live in the Catalan Pyrenees. So this poem is called High Up, in Memoriam, Bernard Loughlin. Between the lark and the lammergire is the uncrowded sky. And in the savage brightness, a Scops owl imagines its own night, more desperate than the harmless one that must come. The earth is terrace and hard ground. House martins flit as shadows lengthen. They are all utterance. Soon they will be gone. And the sun's round mouth will shut tight against the dark. In the distance, the headlights of a car approach, shine with a purpose that hardly matters against the strength of things. And then it matters more than anyone supposed. This next poem is called Blue Shutters, and it's a simple thing that I was at the Barnes in Philadelphia. This is the old Barnes before they made it into this modern museum. And there was simply a Cézanne painting with blue shutters. And in the second that I was there watching, just looking at the blueness of the shutters, how he had made the slats in the shutter, the sheer skill of it, and you could see each brush stroke as well. This entire scenario came to me, so that this is not autobiographical. It's not based on anyone I know. It's simply, I was looking at blue shutters in a painting by Cézanne and wondering what could be going on inside that house where the blue shutters was. So that's really what this poem is. Blue shutters. There were 3 shutters painted blue, and they gave onto the street from the first floor of the long building. In the July afternoon, when closed, they unsettled shapes and textures, made things seem muted, unfinished, withheld. Some family waited in the living room. From that room, a curved stairway led to a windowless landing. The second room to the right, overlooking the courtyard, was the room where she died. If died is not too strong a word. We stayed with her in any case, were quiet for a while, and then went down and told the others what had just transpired. I called the undertaker, shook someone's hand, then crept up the stairs again to find the body covered with a sheet, to protect her, I suppose, making clear that this was where she was, had been. It helped to keep her private and at peace. This next poem is a true story. It's called I Ran Away. I Ran Away, just for those who don't know what it means, is when the IRA had not fully regrouped, I suppose in around 1970, 71, there were big murals in Belfast saying, that the IRA had not been fully involved. It was IRA, I Ran Away, and it was a way of trying to get the IRA to become more involved, which of course, unfortunately they did. And so the I Ran Away has that meaning. It has, I suppose, a double meaning. IRA, I ran away. It's a true story. I ran away. On this very spot 45 years ago, by the canal between Bagot Street and Leeson Street, I was attacked and arrested by 4 hungry-looking members of the Special Branch. They were hunting down terrorists, and I must have had a suspicious look. What stays in my memory is a moment when I was sprinting up to Leeson Street Bridge with the 4 plainclothes cops in pursuit, and I passed a prostitute who was alone, leaning against the railing. "You're worse to run," she said, her tone stoic, implacable, uninvolved. And then later, after they caught me and pinned me down, the branchmen saw that I had a book with me that night. The branchmen saw that I had a book with me that might, I suppose, be helpful in their investigations. One of them took it, opened it, and as his colleagues asked me questions about my putative fight for Irish freedom, the cop flicked through the pages. Soon he indicated to one of the others that he too should examine these lines of verse. Perhaps They held a buried clue to some vast conspiracy against the state itself. I kept one eye on them as I explained to their companions that I was an innocent student. Why did you run when you saw us? They asked. How could I have known, I asked, that you were Branchmen? He looked as if I had questioned the essence of his being. A day later, with my breath back, I knew I should have explained that I ran because within all of us hides a latent guilt that waits to be woken by Branchmen, real or false. What made me run, though, to tell the truth, was that I was simply afraid of my shite. No point in evoking hidden darknesses or atavistic primal forms of shame. Meanwhile, the two Branchmen were still leafing through the book, bored and puzzled, it seemed, by what they found there. They soon indicated to the other Branchmen that maybe the fellow they'd arrested, likely as he was, might not be on the run and not the type to give his life for Ireland. It might be wise to hand him back the book and let him go. I should have explained at the beginning there that a branchman in those years was a special branch, or a branch of the Irish police force, and they were particularly known for going after terrorists and being out of control really in those years. This next poem is called 2 or 3. St. Anne's in Dawson Street on a Sunday afternoon until about 5 or 6 years ago, used to do a wonderful concert of Bach, and really about 3:30 in the afternoon, especially in the winter. And sometimes if you were lucky, Bernard Greevy, the great mezzo or Irish contralto, would sing the contralto parts. And Samuel Beckett's cousin, John Beckett, who was a conductor, he would give a little speech beforehand, really explaining his view of the thing, but his conducting was absolutely minimalist. It was wonderful to watch. And so this is about just a memory of that time in Dublin, in St. Anne's Church in Dawson Street. It's called 2 or 3. No matter how old I grow, the verger at St. Anne's stays the same. He's walking along Bagot Street going home. Most of the singers and players from that time are dead, most of the audience even. On Sunday afternoons in spring or late winter, we were among the youngest at those concerts. Before the hour changed, Dublin was almost dark by 4:30. 2 of them shadow me still. John Beckett, who began by introducing each cantata, his tone brisk, his way of conducting almost factual. Later, I read that he disliked Handel, and Bernadette Greevy's mezzo voice rose by and dry where Samuel sinned. This was Dublin then. The music gathered up the pale light from outside. By the time the concert was over, darkness had mostly fallen. And this poem again sort of speaks for itself. It's called 2 + 1. My heart is watching and weakening, mercilessly counting the beats. It is bored, casually waiting for this to cease. My father died at 53. Vessels leaked in his brain. Then arteries weakened, he moaned in pain. My mother's eyes were grey as his were blue. Her breath rose high above the town before it sank in death. I have there 2 weak hearts in 1 weak heart. Their eyes merged in my gaze. His slow smile, her soft side glance oversee my days. And this last poem is the title poem of the book. It's called Vinegar Hill. Vinegar Hill overlooks the town of Enniscorthy. And for us, it was, it had 2, I suppose, meanings. One, that it was real. There was a set of local authority houses called Vinegar Hill Villas, and people could just say, no, you go up towards Vinegar Hill, and then so it was just used as a name of a place that could be any other name. But of course, it's in the balance. It's where the 1798 rebellion, the last battle was fought there, and the rebels made their way out through a gap called Needham's Gap, the ones who survived. And also, of course, the rebels actually held the hill. And it was a sort of foolish vantage point because, of course, you could hold the hill for as long as you liked, but it was a very easy place to surround. And of course, the Irish side did not have cannons as the British did. The British moved very slowly towards them. And I suppose the poem is some way of trying to suggest, is trying to deal with the real business of it being real rock, it having a real presence over the town. But then no matter what you do, the other business, the business of its place in balance, of its position in the mythology of Irish nationalism, that all that comes in no matter what you try and do in any effort you make to describe it in words, but also perhaps even if you set about painting it. And my mother she went to art classes for a while, and she thought she should paint Vinegar Hill, because that's really, that was the big thing that you sort of would paint. And so she did paint it, and her painting, or one of her paintings of Vinegar Hill, is on the cover of the book. So this is called poem Vinegar Hill. The town reservoir on the hill was built in the 40s. If you lifted a round metal covering and dropped a stone, you could hear it plonk into the depths. There were small hollows in the rocks that, no matter how dry the weather, were filled with rainwater. These rock pools must have been here with different water in them that summer when the rebels fled towards Needham's Gap. From the hill, as the Croppies did, you can view the town, narrow streets even narrower, and more trees and gardens than you imagined. It was burning then, of course, but now it is quiet. There is in the market square a monument to Father Murphy and the Croppy boy. We can see the hill from our house. It is solid rock in the mornings as the sun appears from just behind it. It changes as the day does. My mother is taking art classes, and thinking it natural to make the hill her focal point, is trying to paint it. What color is Vinegar Hill? How does it rise above the town? It is humped as much as round. There's no point in invoking history. The hill is above all that, intractable, unknowable, serene. It is in shade, then in light, and often caught between. When the blue becomes grey and fades more, the green glistens and then not so much. The rock also glints in the afternoon light that dwindles, making the glint disappear. Then there is the small matter of clouds that make tracks over the hill in a smoke of white, as though instructed by their superiors to break camp. They change their shape, crouch down, stay still, all camouflage, dreamy, lost with no strategy to speak of, yet resigned to the inevitable. When the wind comes for them, they will retreat. Until this time, they are surrounded by sky and can as yet envisage no way out. Thank you.
Wonderful to hear those poems, Colm, and thank you for reading the title poem. We had it up at the start, but just so everybody can see it, this is the painting. I'm not sure you can see it, but it's sort of, it has that whole mix of colors and tries to bring in the different kinds of light and the clouds and the smoke of white across the scene as well. And I suppose, and of course, just because you mentioned Cézanne earlier, Colm, as well, I wondered if I could start by asking you a little bit about your poems and painting. And
yeah, I mean, the great thing about Cézanne is you can see how he did it. That he left each brush stroke open, and that you can see. Actually, if you, the more closely you look, the more energy you can get from the work. And then, of course, you stand back and see that he did have an overall sense of what he was doing. But I love how each daub or each mark or each line is slightly different to the previous one in that he added something else each time, getting different sorts of tiny things into the work. So yeah, I think he's really always worth looking at. And there's a lovely geometry, oddly enough, in the work as well. He loves a straight line of the corner of a house or of a man's trouser leg or pipe. Sure. He loves angles, which is odd because you feel he's involved so much in what isn't angular in the rest of what he does. Yeah, so he's pretty helpful, really, Cézanne.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how you have all of this smoke and this indistinctness and these disappearing bits and pieces, but you have the four square stanzas and you have the clear line of it and everything alongside it. And this landscape seems inexhaustible to, like, as I'm reading the poem, it just feels like I would happily have it go on longer, but it does feel like his few landscapes he returns to.
Yeah, that I think that business of Enniscorthy, that, you know, and the, I mean, you know, I hadn't thought about what you talked about, the idea of a market town near the sea that's not on the sea. So it's not Ballybunion, it's not Carricloe, but it's in from there, and it is where people on a certain day of the week were known to gather, where things were bought and sold, and shopkeepers have a particular place in the town. They're also a sort of funny sort of nobility. You can watch them going to mass and think, oh, that's so-and-so, they're from, you know, Court Street. And also the size of the town means that you not only know who's the son or nephew of who, but you know where people are buried. Because the journey to the graveyard is a sort of ritual. You get to know the graveyard, especially over a lifetime. You can see, oh, that's where there's still that grave for so-and-so. And it is as though that you can see life close to its completion in a really odd way. And so the Enniscorthy landscape is not just a landscape, but it is a sort of a thing that's complete in some ways, and it's also, I suppose, locked in memory, in that sometimes there are roads or even people that I haven't thought about for years.
Yeah,
come into my head, or I will be driving along and I'll see someone, and that will bring some memory, and then from the memory you get a sort of energy. But what you need all the time is a melody, you know, and the melody has to come. The memory is fine, you know, you can live on that, but the melody is strange because you can't force it. And if it doesn't come, it just won't come. And if you sit there forcing it, you lose it. And so it's the strangest process, because, well, you know this, but it's the strangest process, because you think it's so unexpected, and it's so unmanageable, in the sense that you can't decide. So so the whole business of the will, the decision-making process, all those elements in the mind are useless, are absolutely no use to you when this business of moving a memory into a melody comes about. And so it's funny.
Can I ask you a little bit about a kind of a question about the melodies that you hear for the poems, Colm? Because I suppose this is the big, like, the short stories, I suppose I'm thinking of as well, have lovely, you can feel a memory and a melody and a moment in them as well. Whether it is, you know, in The Empty Family or in Mothers and Sons, there are stories there which, you know, I can identify maybe a scene that you can feel the story coming out of it, and you hear the melody and it goes from there as well. But when did you realize that the melodies you were hearing were taking you towards poems and not towards stories, or not towards the novels?
I think the Ezra Pound line, you know, the first intention, the first aim was to break the pentameter. In other words, that if I was thinking poem, I was thinking pentameter. And that anything I would imagine as a poem would have to be strictly put into, you know, like a 10-beat line, a 10-syllable line with 5 beats in it, and my mind worked like that. And this was awful, because you were getting these automatic responses to experience or to memory. I mean, the melody itself was just tremendously boring and rigorous, with rigor being the important rigor mortis. And to try and get a loosened tone, to try and loosen up my own voice, was exactly the same process as writing short stories. That I have no short story until exactly the same period as I have no poems. In other words, I'm 50 years old. I've written a novel called The Master. It took me ages. It's filled with words, and I was a lot of revision. And when it was over, I was, you know, I wasn't sad or anything, but I was in a vacuum where there were no words. I didn't need words anymore. And so I found somehow, in a way that maybe a singer could find a way of using breath, I found a natural breathing system for my own voice in a short story, that I could come into it without forcing it, without trying to find an image, or without explaining too much in the opening. And it came on its own, and it came unexpectedly. And the poems were the same, but the first ones were not as easy as that. But later, I found this idea of trying to relax my voice trying to keep away from any thought of a pentameter and see where it would take me if I also found a form for it. That it wasn't as though I would let the poem go all over the page. I don't have the courage for that, of letting a poem go all over the page. So I'm still stuck with 4 lines with some sort of form for this thing. But I'm trying to make it closer to voice, closer to the way someone might speak in a sort of natural way, and also keeping poetry out of the poem. Like if I find, even when I was reading there, after a few lines, I thought, there's too much poetry in that. Get it out, get it out, get it out. And you know, like dwindling is no more dwindling. Nothing dwindles. I've never seen anything dwindle. And so it must not be in any more poems. But there's also in that, for example, that I Ran Away poem where I'm talking about, you know, some sort of, that I ran because of some sort of atavistic shame that is in all of it. Saying, oh, that's just rubbish. I ran because I was afraid.
Yeah.
You know, like just, and Elizabeth Bishop was very helpful here in just saying, you know, poems have to tell the truth. And that's great because it just keeps saying, is this true, what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
And if it isn't true, either leave it in and correct it, which Bishop does all the time, or just take it out and put in something that is true. And that's a great way of thinking about anything. But in a poem, it's tremendously helpful because it gives you the words that you want, and it gets rid of the words you don't want. And so it's very useful.
No, that's great, Colm. I think, and there is sort of a hardness to the scenes. They are like, you know, one of the things we see them so clearly because there's nothing else there other than what is absolutely remembered and feels true as we read them and is true as you're saying. But I was particularly taken by the way that you're writing about Dublin. And obviously you have at times also written about Dublin elsewhere, but it felt like you were accessing ways of writing about Dublin in the poems that felt different to me. And in the amazing referendum poem, I suppose, that I'm thinking of, which Poetry Ireland also published, and this Dead Cinemas, and go on.
I've actually not written about Dublin at all, really. There's no novel set in Dublin, and there may be 1 or 2 stories, but not much.
No.
And there's a lot about going from Enniscorthy to Dublin, but always going back that same day sometimes. And the reason is, of course, that I was in Dublin.
Yeah.
It was all around me and I couldn't see it. And whereas I could see Enniscorthy, I could see Barcelona, I could see various other places. But I've not really written about New York, where I am now, and I've not really written about Dublin. And then, of course, I was in America much more, or I was in Wexford, I was in Dublin much less. And suddenly the 70s, the 80s, those sort of, you know, decades of way that seemed to me very present and pressing, are now history for other people, and then they became history for me. And so, I mean, I think, you know, the business of gay history in any city is all the business of things that have held such power, such focal points for people, and then they went, and no one even knew when they were there that they were there. In other words, they would not know why somebody could be seen walking in that direction. You have to be gay to know that. And Dublin became a funny map of Dublin, whereby gay people in Dublin, particularly in Dublin, did not present themselves as gay in any way that anyone could recognize. So someone from outside often said, there are no gay people. And then you could say, yes, there are, but they're civil servants or they're teachers and they're coming back from work and they're in their suits if they're men, and you would have no idea. And even if you were gay and you knew them and you passed them on the street, you could be an odd nod of recognition. Now, and this is, I'm talking about, you know, people who knew one another in the 70s into the 80s, before all this liberation came. There was a strange way of being gay in Dublin, and a strange architecture of public toilets, cruising grounds, saunas, and 2 pubs, and a few little fleeting disco places. One of which, by the way, in the 70s, a special branch would sit outside, noting who was going in and going out of a place in Parnell Street. Instead of looking for terrorists or looking for some sort of bank robbers, they were looking for us. And I mean, they didn't ever arrest anyone, but it was just the nosiness, the sheer nosiness of them. Anyway, all of this is on my mind. It seems now like solidified in some way that I can see it. And so I could write about the dead cinemas and about the dead gay places. And maybe I'll do some more.
It's an amazing picture of that world, Colm, I think. Like, you know, because the street names are the same, of course, but it is like an alternative universe to what Dublin is now. It's really phenomenally achieved. Yeah.
And I thought about these two sort of everymen, these two guys who just during that referendum, it was for. I think when people talk about gay culture, they're talking about youth culture. They're talking about, because also there's a joke I didn't put into the poem because it's just someone else's joke, but the gay bar, the George, has a disco upstairs, and you go in by the lane to go up to the disco, and the disco is all busy and it's very exciting and everyone's young. But there's a bar, the old George bar is left there. And the young people call that Jurassic Park. I mean, fantastic. So Jurassic has entered the language. So people say, I know, I'll meet you in Jurassic at 9. Because Jurassic is where these old fellas, men in their 40s and 50s, are just drinking pints and wondering what hit them, with all this youth culture going on across the way. Yeah, so Jurassic is part of this deal. But anyway, yeah, the poem comes out of all that business of a sort of lost city, of a sort of ghost city.
Do you miss it, Colm?
Do I miss? People always said, that after the removal of the legalization, homosexuality was banned and then it was allowed, that people's orgasms grew shorter with less groaning once the law was changed. But I never felt that. It didn't have that effect. It didn't do that for me. So no, I just, the idea of the sort of anonymity, the shame, the repression, I miss none of it. I miss none of it.
No. Great. So I have a different kind of landscape question to ask you about now, and it's just to take you back to that amazing Bergman poem and the northern and southern hemispheres and this terrible devouring ocean and the sea. And this is an image I think that I know so well from the novels and I know so well from the stories. And I just wondered, it's these seascapes, I suppose, which you're so drawn to. And I think that is a truly phenomenal poem. This poem where the men who disappear into the sea, this remorseless sea.
And I came across this image. I think it's in Elizabeth Bishop. The idea that both her and Tom Gunn, who were both significantly orphaned, they went in search of a city with hills going down to the ocean. Is Tom Gunn's San Francisco and Elizabeth Bishop's Rio de Janeiro. And in that place, they found comfort, or they found what they had been looking for, as though somehow, I can't connect this properly. But certainly, when the minute I read it, I thought, is that why I went to Barcelona? Is that what those hills above Barcelona and the ocean, is that what they meant? Is that why? But it had never struck me before. But obviously, if there's water anywhere, even a river, I'll buy a river even. But if there's any chance of waves, if there's any chance of being knocked over by a wave, or even the waves of the east coast of Ireland, and if there's anywhere where there's a ship, I'll be found in the line to queue to get off to it. Yeah. And of course, that business and those two instances was really a story you brought home and told people. I was on the Estonia. And what was it like? Did you? I remember I was on a radio program the day it went down, and someone said, "What was it like being on that ship?" As though somehow I had some relationship to the night, And but also on the ship there were 2 restaurants. It was still close enough to the old Soviet business that there was a special restaurant for Baltic people and a special restaurant for Swedes. And I thought,
fantastic. Yeah, the Swedes. Colm, my attention is being drawn to the fact that there are some questions in the Q&A. So Sue Knights asks, have you always secretly written poetry, or was this a response to lockdown, as in the first poem that you read out?
Between the ages of 12 and 20, I wrote poems, and it was a very solitary business to start with because there just wasn't anyone else interested in it. But when I went to UCD, University College Dublin, there were really a lot of people interested in poetry, and I had friends there who were publishing poems, and people like Gerard Fanning, Aidan Carl Matthews, Patrick King, and there were other people around, and we went to all the readings. If Seamus Heaney was reading, we were in the front row. We were at Derek Mann's readings, Evan Boland, anyone who was reading, we were there. So we were eating and drinking and living poetry. The only problem was that mine was no good. And so I would send stuff to David Marcus. I would send stuff anywhere that was taking stuff, and I would get it all back. And eventually I had one little poem in New Irish Writing, which I was terribly proud of, but no one else ever saw. I put the rejection slips on the wall for a while, but that became embarrassing. So I stopped doing that. And when I was 20, I went to Spain, and life took over. There was no solitude. I wasn't alone enough. And I didn't write again. I didn't write a poem again at all, not one, until I was 50. So I have 30 years of pure silence. And it's like being well, it's not exactly like being a failed priest, but it is somehow the idea, the melancholy business of that you were touched by it, that you actually felt it, but you never were able to go on with it. It never leaves you, that. And it made me into a big reader of poetry, and I didn't get bitter. I wasn't one of those. It was just fine, but I really honestly believed that it just had gone and would never come back. It was a big surprise when these little poems came, and then it was an even bigger one when the other thing happened. So no, there are 30 years. It'd be like someone going back to the priesthood, having walked out of Maynooth in a rage one day, 30 years later, going back to the bishop to say, is there any chance I could have another go at it?
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. That analogy was going very well for a while. until right at the priestly end.
Yeah.
Sue Knights also asks about your inspirations in poetry, and I suppose we should say here that you're such a brilliant writer about poetry and have been such a great advocate for so many great poems and poets over the years. And I suppose, but that's a different question to what it is that inspires you. What do you see? Sue's wondering, I guess, that kind of helps you to get started, or
I think that almost for everything I do, that I think when you're 19 or 20, if you could find a critic that pleases you, that critic can give you enormous energy. And I think I got an enormous amount of energy from Ivor Winters. And a book, an anthology, especially called Forms of Discovery. And but he's writing about the use of the particular in poetry. There must be no feelings that are vague. Every feeling must be recognizable to the reader. And I got a lot from that. And I followed it up when I was in Stanford by Ken Fields, who edited that autobiography with him, or edited that anthology with him, was still teaching there. So I could, go to Ken all the time with and of course, so that followed me because of course he was Tom Gunn's teacher. That was why Tom Gunn went to California initially, was to work with Ivor Winters in Stanford. And so there was a sort of line of connection that then went up for various reasons to Elizabeth Bishop. And I suppose also the reading of Lowell, I mean, not the early or late Lowell, but the Lowell of, for example, For the Union Dead. Yeah. When Lowell's lines grew calm. I mean, that is most fascinating business.
It really is.
Bishop pushing him more towards this, and the calmness of her lines. And some 16th century, Thomas Campion, Fulk Greville, Thomas Wyatt, that really I would have learned about from Ivor Winters as well. And so, in a way, I'm stuck at 19. I've never really found anything to replace what I found then. And I've never found anything more useful than the critics I read then and the poems I read then.
And this is a sort of a related question, which is from Esther McKinney. And Esther observes that in your book about Elizabeth Bishop, you talk about the power of the unsaid, about what's not included has such an impact. And Esther asks, how do you find navigating this about what's unsaid when you write your own poems?
And there are a few poems towards the end of the book where, especially one of them that I read about my parents dying, that is not the stuff that I would go on about much. And writing it down and finding a rhymes for it was some way of solidifying it, saying, actually, I have to face this. I have to say it's true. I have to describe it. I have to work out what it means. And that it's, you can talk about silences and what you don't write all you like, but every so often something comes and you see, here it is now. Here it is, and take it. It's almost like, in rugby, please don't let me have the ball, and I have it now. I have to run with it. And so there are a few poems towards the end where I'm actually doing that. And then there are a few poems that maybe another place that are very evasive. And I mean, evasion is part of the deal. You can't go on all the time in a state of saying something really private, really true. You just can't do that all the time. So the poems of evasion seem to me to be as necessary as the poems of confrontation.
I think that's great, Colm. And I think one of the things that I really admire about the poems, I would say reticence, because I think evasion can sneak into coyness sometimes. And your poems are never coy, I don't think, which is sort of because that's the difficulty with it being evasive sometimes, isn't it? But there's
but I would stick to evasive in that that you don't go coy. That evasive is a sort of curling up in the corner, you know, in the shadows, you know, just not making a clear statement that is that has true emotion in it, but actually just trying to make sure that you don't have to do that by saying so, by distracting yourself with a line that amuses you or some observation, some description or observation or something you've noticed or remembered that is there almost as a way of distracting yourself from what you really should be saying, but you're not. So the poem becomes a sort of game around evasion.
Keeping things at bay, almost.
Keeping things at bay is exactly right, John.
That's great. A great observation about how being evasive kind of gives the poems their drama and their tension. And I think this is Michael Schmidt asks or observes again about the openness that you describe in Cézanne is revealing also about the poems, which are not difficult but contain a good deal of their context, but then become complex and thrifty. And Michael then asks, how do you do it? And do you write back from longer drafts to just enough when you're writing?
Sometimes there's a man called John McAuliffe who has suggested to me that a last stanza goes, and it's such a liberation because you think, oh my God, I've been working so hard on trying to get that last stanza. It was work I didn't need to do. Look what could be done. Just a trick of just cutting the last stanza out. So, but it wouldn't be anything more than that. And what's really odd is watching a poem dictate its own form. I mean, just simply that the long line is there. And you say, let's leave the long line. There's a poem called The House in which I suddenly found I was using the word house a lot and that I should stop using it and find some other word for house. And I thought, what if I just used it in exactly the same place in every stanza? So it's the last word of the second line of each stanza with an off rhyme on the fifth line. So you can get used to rhyme with house or half rhyme with it. So that just became, you know, a solution to a problem, that you make it formal, that you sort of go with it. But yeah, the other times would be something almost taken from Bishop, where she would describe, first of all, where she was. Mm-hmm. I caught a tremendous fish. You know, that's what you did. So great, you know, I know exactly what you did. And we can move from there into the poem. And so sometimes with these poems, as you can see, the openings are too clunkily factual. And they're just going on and on and on about, you know, I was walking up the canal in Lee Street. I was going along there. And what I've got to do is try and keep that so the reader doesn't notice when it begins to shift, not do an obvious shift, you know, into dwindling word, you know, like not go into poetry in an obvious place, but try and see if I could tell the story where there's a moment and it turns, but that moment is not clear to the reader that you've actually entered another terrain now, and to try and keep away from that that it might look entirely anecdotal. And your job is to keep it as much in the form of anecdote as you possibly can, and see if you could get one more thing going under it all the time, almost like piano accompaniment, a sort of rhythm going under, but that's never apparent. I mean, that's the theory of it.
Yeah, I really recognize this, Colm, in the poems, this sort of rumbling of other ways of doing it alongside what you're doing in a way that's just really very impressive, I think. Now, Sean Hewitt has another question.
This Sean Hewitt, you know, this Sean Hewitt has written an absolutely marvelous book that I read. it's a sort of autobiography, and it's coming out in what Americans call the fall, which is the most wonderful word in American, but it's in the autumn. And anyway, if this is the same Sean Hewitt, I've never met this guy, but hi, Sean.
Well, Sean is a terrific poet, as we all know, as well as, and we're all looking forward to the prose, Sean. And Sean asks about the longer poems and their narrative skill, with twists and surprises, conversations, rises, falls. And then how do you approach narrative in poetry as opposed to narrative in prose? Or is it this, what's the difference, or when you're thinking about story?
Part of it is the, I mean, look, this sounds like a joke, but I'm serious, is that if you come from a family of 5 and there are a lot of aunts and uncles around, you learn, if you're telling something that's just happened, you've just seen, to keep it concise or make it very interesting. Because if you don't, someone's going to interrupt you and say, shut up, we're tired listening to you. And that if you're coming in at all, you have to come in this way. So it's really just a question of not boring people. I mean, just don't bore people. So therefore, you've got to keep the thing going. And there has to be a sort of rhythmic base for this. There's some element of that. But if you make that too apparent, you lose the reader as well, because you think this is just, you know, a game. And yeah, so it's a question of judgment, really. And it's a question of tact. And you could get it wrong. And also you could get it wrong for different readers. Some could find it irritating. But it's, and it's wonderful because, you know, with that long poem about the 2 gay guys walking around Dublin, you can just add another, yeah, where do they go next? It's sort of, there's a word for it, it begins with a P. I'm just not getting it now, but it's describing a sort of literature where there's just a straight line, it's a journey taken, picaresque. That is a sort of picaresque business, that there's going to be no plot twist as much as just another thing that occurred to say. You know, I mean, the guy says that he's married to his right hand. You just go, oh dear, oh no. And that's sort of Dublin self-deprecating way of describing, you know, something that he doesn't, it isn't self-pity, he just is factual, and you put it in the poem, you know, and you're thinking of the reader just slightly glossing over it and then going, what?
Yeah.
It's just, what?
Yeah. Very good. Colm, I have one more question for you. I think we're going to finish up at 8:15. We're under our instructions. And my question is about how you are enjoying being a debut writer again, because it's so exciting, you know, to have a first book out, and it's a different form. And if it does have that excitement for you after all of the books and the essays and everything, to be having a first book of poems like this, and how that feels for you.
Yeah, I mean, it just means that there are certain times that it will work and certain times it won't, and that's an extraordinary idea. And it's not true with a novel. If you start a novel, you can work every day solidly. Inspiration, you can really decide to work on a novel. You can take it up from where you left it. This is such a mysterious process, this, and it must be how songwriters work. That a melody, I found the documentary on the Beatles fascinating because of just how much time that the camera was left on. And then something would come that later became iconic, but that it came on its own. And sometimes not with words, but just with something. And then it was something more. So working with that and working with, I'm back age 12 in a room where I'm meant to be studying. I'm trying to do physics and it's Latin and teachers I don't like and school I don't like. And I'm on my own, and that's what I do every evening. In that solitude is a line comes and I start working again. And in a way, Los Angeles, where my boyfriend lives, is very solitary. It's a place where you spend a lot of time alone because you can't really go anywhere because there really isn't anywhere to go. And it's a very good city for solitude. It's a very good city for 7 o'clock in the evening, realizing nothing more is going to occur today. And that's a marvelous thing if you're trying to write poems, because, well, if that's true, let's just see what might come next. If I could just have give me a piece of paper. So it's, yeah, I'm back age 12, finding consolation.
Wonderful. So thank you, Colm. And we're going to leave the chat open for a minute. So if you feel free to drop another line in. You're going to get an email tomorrow in which you'll be sent a discount to buy this book. And this is a sort of, it's a really big and amazing book as well, I should say, as well as we've barely touched on I'd say a fifth of the book. There's so much here. So we've loved working on it with Colm and are so happy it's out there. So I'm sure you're all going to enjoy it. Colm, great to see you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you.